Okay, so here we go. Welcome here. My name is Björn Hultin, and I will be moderating. As you can see, it is always a bit complicated to get in, so we are still waiting for a few more people to come. So the way we're doing it is we will have, I will just say a few words, and then we will have Frank Schwalba-Roth, the first Green MEP from Germany, who will be speaking. And then we'll have the two journalists, Gary Cartwright and Jarek, with a difficult last name, sorry. And so that's it. And after, around, we have the room formally until 12:30, but I don't think there's anyone after us, so we are not rushed to get out of here. But then on the second floor in this building, there we will be serving lunch, so you're most welcome to come for that. Okay, so we're talking today about financial fraud, and I would say that no rational or sensible government would want an economy where financial fraud or tax evasion is prevalent. That is irrespective of the color of the government, whether it's left, center, or right, because it destroys confidence in government and takes away the resources that the government would want to spend more wisely. Maybe they wouldn't necessarily do that, but at least that's their aim. Over the past 20 years, we've found that financial fraud was committed on a grand scale by corrupt politicians and international criminals. And governments, of course, have worked hard to introduce laws and regulations to stop this. And in Switzerland, there was created the International Anti-Money Laundering Rules, which in the EU led to the money laundering directives. That is very technical. And as we know, our borders have been more and more open for trade and movement of people and capital, and I think that is something that most of us enjoy and are in favor of. The dark side of that is that, of course, it's also easier for criminals to commit fraud and to hide their proceeds. So that is a challenge. We've also found through the so-called Panama Papers and now the Paradise Papers a lot of interesting information, obviously not always criminal activities. And there are millions of pages. I think the latest one is 12 million pages, which is, takes a few times to read, a few hours to read. And there's a special committee in the European Parliament that is working on these issues. And they just made a 121-page report that's going to be voted later on this month. We also have information about some individuals, which are mentioned in the document about this conference, that I don't know, where do we put that?
On the side there.
On the side there, okay. And Gary Cartwright will talk in detail about some cases, and Jarek will tell us a few things from Poland. Of course, our challenge now is to develop more sophisticated methods of identifying fraud and persuading governments to invest in police and other bodies to investigate and prosecute. Let's see, I just want to acknowledge the presence of the former president of the European Economic and Social Committee, Monsieur le Président Henri Molas. We are very happy, very proud to have you with us. And behind there is my son, Carl, who has done the poster. So, okay. All right. We also have some other former MEP from Poland, who is here.
You.
Yes. And we have quite a number of other VIPs and journalists. So you are all most welcome. So please, Frank, some words of wisdom from you.
Good. Okay. I'm here because of what happened 25 years ago. when the Cold War ended and the European Union set up the TASIS program, technical assistance for the CIS countries. There was a program where I was one of the directors. It was focusing on some parts of the elites, journalists, members of parliaments, and NGOs. And it was to make them more sensitive for an environmental approach in life and in politics. And we had 6 offices, one in St. Petersburg, one in Moscow, one in Kiev, Tbilisi, in Almaty, and Tashkent. Therefore, I traveled for 3 years through these countries. I've been in all of the countries of former Soviet Union, including Mongolia. And the situation was the following. On the one hand, you have the old elites. The Minister for Water Policy in Uzbekistan said, "You from Europe, you can't destroy my life work that we have used the water of the Aral Sea to irrigate cotton plantations." The old elites, but now because of God and biology, they left their job or they left even the earth. Second, you had the movers and shakers, those very, very small elites who looked for a change and who dreamt of living in a Western-style democracy. And you had the third, the most intelligent people in most countries, who saw this as a business opportunity, a shift from one regime to another, to be confronted with good-minded people in Europe and other parts of the world who want to invest, who want to participate in the change. And they saw this was a possibility as well, this third group, of making quick money. When we look now what political scientists or sociologists say, every revolution, every regime change means things are changing considerably. But what you need is, okay, you can have a system with a strong leader, which is wonderful, it secures security, short-term security and short-term progress. But if you have a mid-term or long-term strategy, you have to focus on rule of law, on a strong civil society, and on a strong middle class. But if you have now these autocratic people, some of them from the old times, but mostly people who got the money out of this first change period and then of dealing with donors in the West, it is just the opposite. And now we have situations, if they would happen here in Western Europe, it would be an uproar. Therefore, I organized some time ago an event in the press club on Moldova, where one of the biggest criminal activities I ever heard, more than $1 billion money left the central bank to a bank account of a certain person. And he was very intelligent, possibly more intelligent than most of us. He bribed not only one party, but all parties. He was not only bribing the president, but even the challengers to the president. He was not only bribing the prime minister, but the challengers. And therefore, I'm very, very grateful that this initiative was undertaken today to have 2 non-politicians, 2 journalists, to tell us some of their research. And you will see, even when you are thinking you are very well informed because you read the newspapers, you follow on the web, you will hear incredible things today which you couldn't believe happen. And I propose as well then, when we have afterwards the possibility to eat here on the second floor, try to install personal contact to them, because I think you are all interested in the issue and they are the real experts. Therefore, let's enjoy that we have today 2 real experts here on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. So we pass the floor to Gary. And
okay, Bjorn, thank you. Thank you, Frank. I was asked to come along to this conference and to talk about research that I've been involved with in fraud, corruption, not just in a European context, but in an international context. And the invitation was very timely because I do find myself embroiled in quite a deep and fascinating investigation at the moment, one which goes back to 2004, but is playing out this very week. This has become a global issue. Or a global event, and it's playing out in Belgium this week, of all places. So I thought that this would be very much the issue to talk about. The story begins in 2004 in Kazakhstan, and it begins with a gentleman by the name of Yerzhan Tatishev. Now, Mr. Tatishev was the chairman and key shareholder in a major Kazakh bank, the BTA Bank. Unfortunately, in 2004, he met a very tragic end in what was then reported as a hunting accident. He was with a couple of his friends, or one of his close friends and a bodyguard, and they were hunting wolves. And I kind of, when I look at these things, I love comedy, and I sometimes like to see the events playing out in my mind. And I'm imagining these guys with their shotguns driving around in a car hunting wolves. This is what they were doing. But there was an accident, we were told at the time. A shotgun was fired from the back of the car, and unfortunately, Mr. Tatishev was killed. The investigation floundered. It was considered to be an accident, and the man who had actually been holding the gun at the time, who was a Murat Khan Tokmadi, claimed that this was an accident indeed, and an investigation was carried out into the weapon, and it was found to be defective. Subsequently, this gentleman has actually admitted that this was a murder. It was effectively a contract killing, and that he had paid experts in the region of $40,000 in order to get the required results from them. So we'll go back to that a little bit later, but at this point, with the death of Mr. Tatishev, enters into the story, the main subject of this. And this is one heck of a story, and it's very complicated. I'll try to abbreviate it to get everything in the right chronological order. There's a lot of this you'll say to yourself, this cannot be true. The investigative department of a leading British newspaper just this week asked me, did Ian Fleming write this story? It really is like something from a James Bond film. It concerns a gentleman by the name of Mukhtar Ablyazov. Mr. Ablyazov was a former Minister of Energy in Kazakhstan. And within a month of the death of Mr. Tatishev, Mr. Ablyazov found himself the owner of BTA Bank. What then began to happen? Mr. Ablyazov and his very, very good network. I would say at this point, Ablyazov is a genius. He's often referred to as a financial genius, and anybody who studied this story would agree with that. The man really has something. He set up a network of associates who set up a network of companies, mostly in the Seychelles, British Virgin Islands, which is always very interesting to Britain, of course. And these companies would then attract immense sums of money from BTA Bank for dodgy property deals. Some deals never happened. But the bottom line is that by the time the Kazakh authorities realized something was going on, some $7.6 billion had vanished from the BTA Bank. $7.6 billion. Try to imagine that in a suitcase. Anyway, Mr. Ablyazov fled Kazakhstan very quickly and found himself in the UK. Whilst in the UK, he made himself very comfortable. He acquired a lovely property portfolio. I don't know how many of you are familiar with an area in London known as Bishop's Avenue. It's known as Billionaires Row. Mr. Ablyazov acquired there a £20 million mansion, complete with ballroom, wonderful grounds. I've actually seen, I've got a copy of the floor plans. This is some property, but it wasn't enough. As well as that, there was also a £1 million apartment in St John's Wood, very close to Lord's Cricket Ground, very, very prestigious address. And on top of that, every gentleman, of course, should have a £20 million, 100-acre estate in Windsor, very close to Windsor Castle, where the Queen lives, and also one of the country's most prestigious golf courses. So he'd feathered his nest very well, and even managed to claim political asylum, claiming that he had fled Kazakhstan because of some differences there. He styled himself as an opposition figure, opposed to the current leader, President Nazarbayev, and was temporarily granted asylum on that basis. However, things didn't go so well for him. Kazakhstan issued some 11 writs against him in the English courts. And as I said, a lot of the money that we were talking about that went missing found itself in the British Virgin Islands, so this comes under British competence, and therefore probably that was not the best place for him to go at that point, London. But that's where he found himself. And after a series of court cases, with no less than, get this, 35 barristers representing him in court, he was found guilty of corruption and embezzlement. His assets, which were, I think it was somewhere in the region of 4 billion, in the UK it was £421 million were frozen, and he was subject to an asset freeze and forbidden to dispose of his assets. Well, he declined to abide by the court's rulings, and so he did indeed dispose of his assets illegally and was called into court for contempt of court. He was found guilty and sentenced to 22 months in jail in the UK. This would have been his second jail sentence, by the way, because he'd already served time in Kazakhstan previously. Unfortunately for the British justice system, he didn't actually go to jail because he fled the country in a bus on a false passport immediately before sentencing and found himself in France. His asylum was removed, by the way, because it was considered that he had applied for asylum because he was being persecuted on political grounds for political activity, but the court ruled that actually it was a financial crime that he was being prosecuted for. A lot of people are saying that maybe the Kazakh court was a little bit biased against him, but I don't think those allegations have been raised against the English courts, who were actually very fair on him and even held an appeal against the sentence that he received. But it's when he gets to France it gets very interesting, and this is one of my favourite little parts of the story. I hope you enjoy this as much as I did when I first heard this. He had gone into hiding in France, and he was found because of a lady who was acting as his lawyer, who is described, every tabloid would describe such a lady as a glamorous, leggy blonde, which indeed she was. She was his lawyer, and if you believe the French press, his lover. She was attending a court case in London, and she was followed by private investigators. She was followed through London, where she did a lot of shopping. She was followed to Heathrow, where she got on a plane for Paris, and in Paris she did quite a lot of shopping. And then she drove to meet Mr. Ablyazov, and I love this bit. She led the investigators to the villa, or mansion, if you like, where the gentleman was staying. But they reported that prior to arriving at the mansion, she stopped off at her own apartment and got changed into a very short dress and or skirt and some 4-inch heels, and then drove to meet Mr. Ablyazov, parking her vehicle some distance away from the mansion, but that's probably a very wise move on her part because the mansion actually belonged to her husband. More of him later. The lady's name was Elena Tishenko, by the way. Having spent some 24 hours, I believe, with Mr. Ablyazov, she then flew to Moscow. Very, very brief stay in Moscow, and then back. This is very important. The trip to Moscow is very important, and that'll come in a bit later. As a result, Ablyazov was arrested. There was a story that he had a private militia, so he was arrested by French special forces, very heavily armed, very serious guys, and they took him into custody, and he spent the best part of 3 years in a French jail as a result, before being freed. He was subject to, at one point, 3 extradition warrants, and also he was on the Interpol's red list, as were some of his accomplices. Now, nepotism and patronage come into this story quite a lot, and I'll just quickly introduce the Krapunov family. Viktor Krapunov was the former mayor of Almaty, who made a lot of money on some very dubious property deals. They seem to pop up a lot. And a lovely detail of that story is that Mr. Krapunov's wife was a television presenter who woke up one morning finding herself owning the entire television station. These things can happen in post-Soviet space very, very easily. And Mr. Krapunov, his son Ilyas, who is also wanted by Interpol for organised crime activities, is married to Mr. Ablyazov's daughter. So nepotism and patronage we will come across a lot. We'll come across a lot. Extradition warrants have not been executed. The French are saying that it's quite possible that in Kazakhstan he may not receive a fair trial. The extradition warrants that are still outstanding for Ukraine and Russia have not been executed because there is a feeling that those countries will be very close to Astana, and there is a chance that if he were extradited to those countries, he would find himself in Kazakhstan, and on that basis he remains now in France. But this is where we bring the story very much up to date. He's in France, but the net is tightening. The net is tightening. There's still the outstanding prison sentence in the UK. There are still the extradition warrants. The arguments concerning political prosecution, I'll just very, very quickly read something here. I acquired this recently. This is coming here from the British High Court. I have doubts regarding the conclusion that the aim of the claimant in the court proceedings against the respondent, Ablyazov, was to remove him as the president's political opponent. The claimant had to save itself from bankruptcy. This is the reason BTA have taken action against Ablyazov, because they had to save themselves from bankruptcy. It's got nothing to do with the fact that he was a political opponent, and that line does come up time and time again, also in United States court papers, because there's some form there as well. So where is he going to go? This week he's been in negotiations with the Belgians about obtaining Belgian citizenship. Can you imagine? Belgian citizenship. Belgium, of course, is one country where you can claim asylum if you feel you will be persecuted in another EU country. It's a slightly unusual circumstance, but that is the situation. Of course, we're aware of that because the President of Catalonia has been in a similar situation, speculation about his claiming asylum. Why is Mr. Ablyazov so keen to remain in the EU? Well, there are obvious reasons why he doesn't want to go to certain places. But why the EU? He seems to have established something of a network of apologists is the wrong word. It's always difficult when you're talking about post-Soviet countries. You can explain how things happen. Go back to 1992 when there were no rules. It was like the Wild West. You can explain how things happen, but explaining them doesn't justify them. And I don't think you can say that, well, you know, I was an opponent of the government and so therefore I was suffering from problems, so I had to leave the country, and then when I got there I set up fake banks and stole lots of money and ran away from a court before I was sentenced and travelled on false paths. That doesn't really, being persecuted doesn't really justify that behaviour, which is continuing to this day. One of the most interesting things I found is that Mr. Ablyazov appears to have become something of a cause celeb for a human rights NGO based here. Well, it's based in Poland, actually, but they have an office here. And whilst I would say that this particular foundation has done a great deal of work in post-Soviet space, a very good deal of work, they have some very good people there, there's something else going on behind this particular foundation, and the more I learn, the more concerned I get. Well, I won't actually say anything about the foundation because I understand that my colleague here, I'm very pleased to learn is going to be here today, knows a great deal more than I do. So the organisation is called the Open Dialogue Foundation, and I think if I could maybe pass the floor at this point.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gary, for that excellent presentation. And then we'll then see Jarek Jakimczyk. Is that correct?
Thank you. That's correct. All above, thank you for inviting me here to discuss such tempting issue. As a journalist, I spent decades on investigating problems related to secret services, especially communist and post-communist in Eastern Europe. Due to my long experience on that field as a journalist, I was asked to comment on the latest publications about Open Dialogue Foundation established in Poland in the town of Lublin. And the recent controversies regarding Open Dialogue Foundation's activities arose after Bartosz Kramek, head of the foundation board, during July's protests against legislations changing Supreme Court functioning, as well as National Judiciary Committee and Public Court system, published on his Facebook account a kind of manifesto under the title, "Let the State Stop. We will turn the government over." It has been 16 points representing, according to the author, way to stop the ruling party, PiS, it means in Polish Law and Justice, from destruction of rule of law in Poland. Text has been inspired by events at Ukrainian Euromaidan in 2014, which the Foundation Open Dialogue actively supported. To tell the truth, until the main field of the Foundation's activities was supporting of democratization in Ukraine and defending such people as, for example, Mukhtar Ablyazov, according to the Foundation, persecuted by the non-democratic authorities of Kazakhstan, for me it was just one of the many NGOs that were constituting an open society in Poland. I should to add, I didn't know details of the story and the case of Mukhtar Ablyazov. But now, when one of the Foundation's leaders make a call for citizens' disobedience, such as non-payment of taxes and so on, I ask the question, on behalf of whom is he acting? Of course, he could be acting on behalf of himself. However, if we take a close look on the financial sources of the Foundation Open Dialogue, and I'm not talking about the relations with George Soros and his famous Open Society Institute, which in my opinion is totally irrelevant. Here we can come to the conclusion that there is something that may be so obvious, may not be so obvious for a public opinion in Europe. What is it? Well, there are two things. Let me point them out. One, most of the donations made to the Open Dialogue Foundation are coming from the Ukrainian business that is interconnected with Mayak factory established in Sevastopol, which is owned by President of Open Dialogue, Ludmila Kozłowska's brother, Pietro Kozłowski. Mayak factory is located on Crimea Peninsula, occupied by Russian forces. Sevastopol is the main base for Russian Black Sea Fleet. According to records from SBIS, it is Russian equivalent of trade register. Pietro Kozłowski is at the time an only owner of Mayak factory. And what is more, after the annexation of Crimea Peninsula, he got rid of his partners and took over the 100 assets of the company. Documents from a commercial register that were found are dated October 9th, 2017. So very fresh. Early partners Vladimir Petelin, Igor Ochkanov, Alexander Klishko, Alexei Kołoskow, Yulia Tanchi, and Maria Oleszczenko left the business. The second point, Mayak factory is connected with Russian companies that are trading with Russian Navy. Mayak is a business partner and one of the main suppliers of Russian capital group Sievmash, located in Severodvinsk at White Sea, which is responsible for manufacturing, maintenance, and repairs of Russian nuclear submarines. As far as I know, Sievmash is on the list of the Russian companies that were sanctioned after the annexation of Crimea. I mean, for example, a US sanction. Sievmash produces highest-class nuclear submarines for the Russian Federation Navy. factory employs 25,000 people and is on the list of companies sanctioned by Western countries. Sivmash produces newest types of submarine of 955 Bourier and 885 Yassine class. Those vessels can carry up to 16 ballistic missiles, Bulava, in NATO codes class SSN-30. Those submarines are direct threat to all NATO members. Mayak factory, owned by Pietro Kozłowski, president of Open Dialogue Foundation's Ludmila Kozłowska's brother, is co-creating power of the Russian submarine fleet. The third point, Mayak business environment has ties to occupational government of Crimea Peninsula. I mean Alexei Chawy, a businessman and politician from Sevastopol town. He was organized the opponent actions towards Ukrainian Maidan, and he called himself a mayor of Sevastopol. Later he took part in signing a treaty of joining the Crimea Peninsula to Russia, and afterwards becoming the first separatistic mayor of Sevastopol. So he is the owner of Tavrida Electric, a company located on the Mayak complex in Sevastopol and cooperating with it on technological cluster. Alexei Chawy is sanctioned by the Ukraine, European Union, and his money has been frozen in Estonia. The fourth point, in November 2014, just a few weeks before the decisions of the Russian authorities about the expropriation of the Ukrainian entrepreneurs in Crimea, company Mayak and ZSS Mayak, the second one owned by Mr. Pietro Kozłowski, were excluded from the list of companies that were subject to expropriation. The data about main customers of ZSS Mayak company come from official Russian public procurement bulletins and from press articles. Shortly after the investigation of OSINT journalists in Poland has been published, Open Dialogue Foundation deleted their financial statements from the web. And contrary to the statement of Mrs. Kozłowska, the sisters of Pietro Kozłowski, her brother still owns Mayak factory. What is more, now he possesses 100, as I said earlier, of its shares. The list of main customers of his company, ZSS Mayak, from Sevastopol, includes, for example, such companies as Yera in Kaliningrad, Siewmash in Siewirodwinsk, Zwiezdoczka in Siewirodwinsk, Amurska Shipyard, Admiralskaya Shipyard, Kronstadtskaya Shipyard, SNSZ Shipyard. All these entities are subsidiaries of Russian conglomerate, OSK, that is listed as sanctioned by US authorities. And above all, among the donators, we can find such individuals as Andrei Vladimirovich Brovchenko, I mean donators of Open Dialogue Foundations, of course. Andrei Vladimirovich Brovchenko, who donated 176,000 of Polish zloty. It's around 45,000 euro. It is necessary to define whether he is the same person as Andrei Vladimirovich Brovchenko, the shareholder of ZSS Mayak of St. Petersburg, the Russian company that sells Mayak's products in Russia, to the Russian Navy, of course, to the suppliers of Russian Navy. The next individual, Arkady Evgenievich Agarkov, who donated 440,000 won of Polish zloty, around 110,000 euro. He's the head of Stal Company of St. Petersburg, which is another commerce representative of ZSS Mayak from Sevastopol, and of course supplier of Russian Navy manufacturers. Both of them individuals have passports and citizenship of Russian Federation. While concluding my concise speech, I'd like to ask how is it possible that as a head of Open Dialogue Foundation, acting in Poland, someone can support the democratization of Ukraine and Western sanctions against Russia, and at the same time, receive donations from businessmen supplying equipment for Russian nuclear submarines? It seems to be rather obvious that such business activities, I mean the transactions with manufacturer of Russian Navy strategic vessel, is possible only with acceptance and under strict control of Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, especially its main military counterintelligence directorate and its regional unit in Sevastopol. It means that if someone would like to become supplier of factory responsible for manufacturing, maintenance and repairs of Russian submarines, must be checked by FSB and get its clearance. Imagine that someone like this, I mean ODF leaders, ODF financial leaders, stopped to accept Polish government, and while acting as a foundation in the framework of Polish law, they started to call for citizens' obedience and tax omission. Let's think, is anything bizarre that a group of members of Polish Parliament issued an interpellation to Minister of Interior asking whether Polish authorities are monitoring the activities of Mr. Bartosz Kramek, the head of Foundation's board, and her wife, Mrs. Ludmiła Kozłowska, head of Foundation, president of Foundation. Also, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, undertook some steps to oversee the functioning of ODF. They consist of asking the Regional Court of Capital City Warsaw to establish compulsory boarding and seizing its present board according to legal regulations on NGOs governed by Ministry from 6 April 1984, asking chairman of the board, Mrs. Ludmiła Kozłowska, why on the official Facebook account there are posts encouraging people to undertake illegal actions such as tax omission, personal attacks aimed at certain people, and why Bartosz Kramek, head of Foundation's board, while publishing posts of similar content, also publishes information about his role in the ODF board. Call to immediately delete from ODF's official web pages information that is a call for illegal actions aimed against government, as well as posting of an official petition to the IRS in Warsaw asking them to conduct complex financial control in the ODF Foundation, as it has publicly called to public tax omission. What is wrong? The attitude of the leader of the ODF Foundation and their statement at the official page of Foundation, or reaction of some politicians and the Polish government in this situation? I leave this question open.
Okay, Jarek,
thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for this very detailed description of the situation. Yes, Frank, you have a question? Yes.
Fascinating. I tried to follow. Sometimes it was difficult, but I followed. Question, is it published, your results? Is it possible to have it in front of me on another occasion or for anyone else? Yes or no?
Yes, it was published.
Ah, where? When?
In Polish or in...
In Polish. On the Facebook, at the private Facebook website of Mr. Marcin Rej, It is a social media journalist and OSINT investigator.
Okay, but if I would be your private consultant, my recommendation would be take this text and try to publish it in a media, and there were several media, and we can speak about this later, who would be very interested in publishing it. Because what people here, and me and others, would like to take concrete actions to make it impossible that this will continue.
There were some articles in Polish media published in recent months related to the activities of ODF Foundation.
Apologies, but the problem is Polish is not the most spoken and understood language.
Not only in Polish.
Okay, in English, wonderful. Okay.
If you
Now, the world is not just neither German nor Polish is the main language, it's English. Therefore, okay.
If you need more details related to this story, to this case, and some links, I can send you by mail after the conference.
All right. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Now, we leave the floor open to participants. If you have any questions, not necessarily just related to the cases that we have discussed, but any other questions or comments that you have on the topic. Yes, please. Please, just a few words to say which media that you're representing.
David Aviago from Argus. I had a question in terms of just the institutions here, OLAF and EU. Has any of this, because Frank, you mentioned the EU program there. What's it? TASIS, sorry, the name escapes me now. But Gary, I think you seem to have some implications for sort of possible misuse of EU funding. So I don't know if that exists. But have there been any investigations from OLAF or any other EU institutions?
Okay, David, on that one, there have been a lot of suggestions that ODF has received EU funding. I haven't found any evidence of that at this point. I have asked the Commission that question, and I didn't get like a very full or detailed response, but they said that no, ODF is not in receipt of European Commission funding. But European Commission funding is not the only type of funding that's available. That's pretty much an ongoing sort of investigation. One of my colleagues is working on that at the moment. We'll let you know.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Peter Kleppe from Open Europe.
Open Europe. Yes, thank you. Question for Gary. You mentioned that, I'm Belgian myself also, that this Kazakhstan gentleman is trying to apply for asylum in Belgium or is trying to obtain Belgian citizenship. Well, I'm sure you're aware that we have our other famous Kazakh-Belgian oligarch, Mr. Patok. He's one of the big three oligarchs in Kazakhstan who managed somehow to obtain Belgian citizenship. And recently there was a scandal with some allegations made about a Belgian politician who would have helped him with the help of Sarkozy. I don't know what's proven, what's not, but I do think there would be a lot of interest in the Belgian media to report about this. So I think you should try to spread that story over here.
I've got a little something here in front of you, just a bit more detail on that. This is from the last few days. Apparently, Ablyazov has been in secret talks over the summer with Dirk van der Malen, President of the Belgian Commission, and Ablyazov is expected to appear in front of that commission in Brussels later this month. And what they're suggesting here is that his part of the bargain will be to give evidence against Patok Choriev and Alijan Ibragimov in Belgium. That's all we know at the moment. As I say, this is really in the last few days that this has emerged.
So there will be some kind of a bargain, you're saying? So Belgium is saying you will get asylum if you give some information about some of our Kazakhstani citizens here. That's correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think it's a very big story, but as I say, at the moment we're only getting trickles through. Just in the last couple of days, talks about these secret talks over the summer.
As I understand it, the guy he would very much like to come to Belgium, but it's one thing wanting and another thing being able to do it. And, with all the bad publicity there has been in those other cases, my guess is it will be very difficult. But we will find out and we'll follow it up and see what happens.
For those who are not following this, because you're not from Belgium or not reading the Belgian newspapers, in 42 seconds, in the 90s, Tractebel, a big Belgian energy company, cooperated with Kazakh energy structures and Kazakh money. And a lot of money was injected, legally and semi-legally and illegally. And as a consequence, 2 families got nationality, Belgian nationality. And the richest Belgian is now one of them. He's not living in Belgium. And key politicians played a key role in getting this nationality, and therefore the mayor of Waterloo had to step down. Former president, I think it was the Senate, mayor in Uccle, here one of the commune, had to step down as well. And I have 2 friends from Kazakhstan who live here in Brussels, and they're always nearly lying when they are asked from where they are from, or we are from Russia, because they don't want to say that they're from Kazakhstan, because then all these people will say, oh, you are certainly linked, patati patata. But in reality, to save, I don't know if a Kazakh person is here, they were all born, nearly all born in Uzbekistan. But therefore, it is something very, very difficult as a Kazakh in the moment, or Uzbek, to get your nationality only, and you pointed out on the weak point, if you are able to deliver secret informations, then as a compensation. But I don't think that this is a reason to get Belgian nationality. Therefore, I think it's only a question of time that Belgian journalists will jump on exactly this case. And you are among the very first who have heard this news. Congratulations.
Gary, you have some comments?
Yeah, I wanted to go back a little bit to the funding of ODF, because you mentioned there the connection with the Russian Navy and etc. And it sort of reminded me of a little something that I came across. We've all got an idea of what a human rights organisation does, a human rights NGO. We've got a very clear idea. And, when I started to look at this, I didn't want to believe bad things about a human rights NGO, but I see things that are really, really interesting, which you would not expect to see from a human rights NGO. I'm referring to something here. It's a briefing that I've done for the British press. And if I can take from here, ODF held briefly a licence to supply military equipment for use in eastern Ukraine. Polish radio Polsha reported on the 2nd of August this year that the authorization had been issued by one Peter Pytel, former head of Poland's military counterintelligence service, who it has been claimed has been accused of cooperation with Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB. You asked, where does the FSB come into this? And in June of this year, the Polish Interior Ministry actually revoked the license to supply military equipment. Now, I've never, ever come across this before from a human rights NGO. I wondered, eastern Ukraine, that can mean either one of 2 things. And so I have asked the Ukrainian authorities, what do they know? Is this defensive equipment that's been supplied to Ukrainian soldiers or to militia? And the answer was very evasive. I had the impression they didn't really want to open this particular can of worms. But it's not only supplying military equipment. If that is not unusual enough for a human rights NGO, have a look at the ODF statute. It allows them to engage in gambling and gaming activities. Now, I've never seen a human rights NGO that's engaged in gambling. But this is very, very interesting, because when you look at their list of donors, you will find a couple of companies there involved in this very activity. one of which is an online gaming company, and the other which is a company that processes online transactions. Now, if you are running an online gaming company, you need somebody to process your transactions. So the two go side by side, and we have two of them donating money to ODF. Now, this interested me because a little while ago I was privy to some research on this very subject, particularly of illegal online gaming, which is a massive business, you can't imagine. And there's a model. There's a model for this. I didn't do the research. I was basically just editing it into a sort of a form of English which was more suitable for the press. And I noticed there's a model. These companies, as I say, there will be the gaming company and there will be the payments company. When these sites are taken down, these gaming companies, the sites self-replicate. This cannot be stopped. It's all done with illegal software, and it's a massive business. And one thing I've noticed is that these companies tend to be run by Russians and or Ukrainians, and they tend to be based in either Cyprus or Malta. And surprise, surprise, guess where the companies that have been funding ODF are based? And guess who are the principals? Now, I cannot say because I've seen no hard evidence, but there's a little bit of a coincidence. And the one other thing, talking about the direct funding of ODF, now, we all know that there's speculation as to whether Ablyazov actually set up ODF and what level of control he has over ODF. A gentleman by the name of Ivan Sierstuk was with ODF from the very beginning of the foundation and had previously run an organisation called Dialogue for Development Foundation in Poland, and Ludmila Kowalska, who we're talking about, the president, was actually one of his colleagues there. And he has said in a report, and it's the report that you referred to, Maxine Ray. And in this, he does refer to this. And in this, it's alleged by Ivan Sierstuk that he was receiving financial support for ODF from Mukhtar Ablyazov through the bank of the owner of the Ukrainian-based Fortuna Bank. The owner of Fortuna Bank was one Sergei Tishenko. Sergei Tishenko is the ex-husband of the glamorous leggy blonde previously mentioned, and the owner of the villa in which the two were found together by investigators. Alina Tishenko, I mentioned earlier, actually, I'm sorry I didn't finish that particular thread, having spent that time with Ablyazov, then went off to Moscow. She appears to have stayed in Moscow for less than 24 hours before returning to France. On her next trip to Moscow, she was arrested on suspicion of money laundering and spent time in a Russian jail. This was some $3 billion that we're concerned with, and those investigations into her relate to her time as when she was working as a lawyer for Ablyazov. So you see, we get back to patronage and nepotism all the time. So there are more questions than answers, as Larry Sifri once famously sang, but I've never seen an organisation with so many questions.
So when you say ODF, I think that's Open Dialogue Foundation, right? So, yeah. Okay, so please, are there any yes? Monsieur le Président, yes, you have the...
No, thank you. I would just like to thank you for the invitation and to congratulate the journalist and our colleague for the excellent work. We all know that the post-Soviet time has been, in some occasions, worse than the Soviet, concerning transparency, social conditions, and all kind of, I would say, gangsterism or criminality. So I think this all has to be followed. Just a short comment on the ODF. I have in my own activities of the Economic Social Committee. We have had also some concern about George Soros activities and ODF activities, because in some cases I think they exceed the limit of what we can imagine from this kind of organization. I just rely on what you say about this Facebook statement concerning the attitude for the Polish citizen to stop to pay tax or things like that, which is almost suspicious and not, I think, the the normal activities of NGO, and I think the transparency in NGOs funding should always be encouraged. Some of these NGOs, transnational NGOs, the problem is that then it's like transnational or multinational companies. Then it's difficult because they have different offices in different countries, so you don't know where the money comes from at global level. And I think that this should be a task from the European Union and from the UN, if it's possible, to get more transparency on companies, but also on NGOs. I will just briefly to come to the topic of the week in Europe, and not just in Europe. It's the Paradise Papers. I think although some activities are not criminal, I will just mention how great is the prejudice, not just for the taxpayers, because this is tax evasion. Even if it's legal, it's tax evasion. But also the prejudice toward the companies I represent, meaning the small and mid-sized enterprise, who have no means and no capacities to use this tax evasion and who pay normally all the VAT and all the tax. So there is in this money laundering and tax evasion is not just a prejudice to the taxpayer. It's of course a prejudice to the democracy, and we see with some criminal links, but it's also a prejudice for a sane economy, because you create a double standard economy where the normal entrepreneurs will have to be taxed and pay everything, and some who have the connection and the big size, which have a possibility to establish their company in Bermudas, Isle of Man, Malta, or some others. And I think it's a real problem, not just it's a problem for the democracy, and it's a problem for a sane economy. But thank you to have invited me for this very interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments, and thank you very much for following these issues very, very closely. I know that it is very complicated and very difficult. Okay, any more comments or questions? Yes, please. Please introduce yourself. There's a button there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a blogger in Brussels, and I would like to know what is the solution of this financial embezzlement. And there is also a major scandal related issue in the UK. Vijay Mallya, an Indian who has been arrested, but India has demanded his extradition to India. And secondly, are you satisfied with the Panama leaks follow-up, as Finnish Prime Minister has also resigned, but in Panama leaks there are many international figures, like in Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif also involved in it, and he is also facing the trial. So how you see the international dimensions of leaks and European role? Thank you.
Like I mentioned before, there is a report done by this Panama Papers committee in the European Parliament, 121 pages. So that is available for consultation. It hasn't yet been voted on, but okay. Any more questions or comments?
Poland don't want to take the floor. No one from Poland. Okay.
All right. So, Jarek, any more comments?
We do have in Poland since the 90s a lot of NGOs with foreign roots. For example, the German ones like Friedrich Ebert Stiftung or Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. It is obvious that they are part of soft power of German state, of German business, but no one until now tried to call citizens to disobedience and to tax omission. It is precedence. Thank you.
Gary?
Yeah, one thing that, I look at all this and I wonder when $7.6 billion was being embezzled and when the same gentleman was able to set up, off the top of my head, it was 15 or so false companies to get loans that there was no intention of repaying from the US and other places. I always ask myself the question, who was looking the other way? Because when all this was going on, somebody was looking the other way deliberately. Because the scale of this fraud is such that the hearing at the High Court in London was the largest ever fraud case heard in the United Kingdom. The scale of it is just astronomical. How do we solve these? All these people should be brought to justice. But how do we do this? Do we need something along the lines of the court in The Hague where people can be guaranteed a fair trial without any kind of political overtones? Because we all know it happens. We've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in this particular parliament where we have seen MEPs, British MEPs, accused of certain transgressions, and those that belong to the ruling party just carry on regardless, and those that are in opposition find themselves in court. So no one is innocent in this. The other side of this discussion, I think this is very important. Everybody's very aware of fake news, the problem of fake news, the way that it's disseminated so easily through social media. People who use social media, what they access is what they want to see, what they want to hear. And so if you can tell them exactly what they want and do that in a way to get a message across, to attack your enemies, to persuade them to vote a certain way in a referendum, you have an enormous amount of power. We're addressing the issue of fake news, but here in the EU context, the European context, we maybe need to look at the issue of fake NGOs. Now, we know, I worked here as a staff member for a very long time, we know that there are NGOs that exist in Brussels and their main purpose is to hoover up Commission funding. They don't actually do anything, and there's lots of them. ODF, as I say, when I started to look at them, I didn't want this to be true. I didn't want to think that a human rights NGO could be abusing the system and could be carrying out another agenda. I could refer to the comments of another Polish MEP, Anna Fogita, who has made some very damning statements recently about ODF and has basically said that they are discredited, they are no longer a non-partial, non-political NGO. Maybe this is the first time we're going to see this. I fear it might not be the last time, but I think we do need to get a grip on the possibility of fake news being supplanted by fake NGOs.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gary. Yes, Frank. Merci d'être venu.
I would like to, my last comment on money. We all know what is €5, €10, €100, €1,000, 10,000. Possibly we know what is a million. Billion is very difficult. Milliarde. Billion is very difficult to imagine. I found a way of making it more understandable for me what is a billion. This I would like to share with you. Imagine this is a person 20-year-old, 20 years. Since the first week when this young person was born, up to now, 20 years, every Saturday, this person has won 1 million in the lottery. Imagine, 20 years, winning 1 million. It's very difficult to achieve one time in your life. But 20 years, every Saturday, every weekend, 1 million in the lottery. Altogether is 1 billion. It's incredible, huh? That means we can imagine what is 1 million because some houses are sold for $500,000, $250,000, 2 million. But 1 billion is very difficult to imagine. Remember, 20 years winning every weekend in the lottery 1 million, that's 1 billion. Yep. That's a lot. And we heard figures of several billion. That's even more. Thank you.
Well, as a matter of fact, in this building, European Parliament, there are approximately 7,500 people working, or at least employed. And so $7.5 billion, that would be enough to give $1 million to each and every one. And, you know, and I don't think many would complain, but anyway. All right, any more questions or comments? No.
And food is waiting, huh?
Food is and drinks, they are waiting for us. And do you have, Gary, any final comments? Jarek? Yeah. Frank, you've done your already? Okay. All right. So we go down then to the second floor, to the restaurant, and we'll do some networking and don't hesitate to talk to the speakers and so on. And after that, we will try, for those who are not familiar with the European Parliament, we'll try to explain a little bit and to visit a little bit more. So anyway, thank you very much for your participation, and welcome down. We'll all go down together on the second floor. Thank you so much.